Good afternoon. Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome you to the second of our three-part series of Hopkins in Baltimore. Today's panel is extraordinary. We have four people who work in very different fields, in very different areas, but are connected to a vast array of experiences. First of all, they all grew up in Baltimore. One of the things that I think that you will learn is that growing up in Baltimore is not growing up in Baltimore, is not growing up in Baltimore. There is a West Baltimore and an East Baltimore and a South Baltimore, and the experiences that people have, depending on where they grew up, are very different. Two of our panel, however, went to high school here in East Baltimore, to Dunbar High School. And for those who don't know or aren't familiar, Dunbar, during the era of segregation, was the black high school in this part of Baltimore. And I think it probably is fair to say that every leading African-American politician, leader who grew up at least on this side of town, and who is over 45 years of age, came through Dunbar High School. It was really the cornerstone of the community. Adrienne Mosley is a social worker. She works here at Johns Hopkins as the administrator of the Office of Community Health. She has grew up in East Baltimore. She got her social work degree at Adelphi University and has worked at Hopkins in one way or another for 35 years, for the past 20 years in the Office of Community Health. As part of her responsibility, Adrienne coordinates the Head Start and Early Head Start program that is under her umbrella. Stephen Ragsdale, who will actually be the first speaker, also works at Hopkins, is at the Armstrong Institute, and he is a quality and innovation coach. He has 20 years of experience in IT and health systems. We have had the opportunity to participate, as has Adrienne and others. Last week, Reverend Debbie Hickman spoke about the Baltimore Book Club, and Stephen has been one who has a profound knowledge and understanding of the history of Baltimore and how we came to be where we are and what we are. Douglas Miles is Bishop of the Koinonia Baptist Church in Baltimore. He too is a native. He graduated from Paul Laurence Dunbar High School and is a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. I will tell one story because it had a profound effect on some of the work of the Urban Health Institute. Early on, when I first met Bishop Miles, you were talking about your experience in high school, I think it was, working in a laboratory, and the importance that had, and what it meant to me to hear this story became translated in the work and expansion of the Summer Works program here at Hopkins, and expanding it for some students also to continue on through the years. At that point in his life, Bishop Miles thought that medicine was in his future, but a calling took him in a different direction. The fourth of our panel is Ralph Moore. Ralph's background is equally fascinating and equally grounded in Baltimore. He attended St. Pius V Catholic Elementary School in West Baltimore and was educated by the Oblate Sisters. The Oblate Sisters of Providence is the oldest African-American, I don't have the language right, Ralph, but group of...
Order of Sisters, yeah.
Order. Yeah. That's the word I was searching for. The oldest African-American order of nuns. And not only was he educated and his family educated by them, but he then went and worked at St. Francis Academy, an extraordinary place from which he just retired like 2 weeks ago as the director of the Academy Community Center at St. Francis. So it is an extraordinary panel. Oh, the other thing that these four individuals have in common is they're not short of perspective and opinion. With that as introduction, let me turn it to you, Stephen.
Good afternoon. Can anybody in the audience tell me how many named neighborhoods there are in Baltimore? Named neighborhoods. There are over 225 named neighborhoods in Baltimore. I'm going to talk a little bit. I want to help give context to what Baltimore is today, and kind of like through my little prism. I always say that there are not a whole lot of surprises for me here in Baltimore because I've seen its history, and through its history, you can kind of see where we are today. If you look back at Baltimore's history, it's one of the fastest growing populations in the country. It was the second largest human port in America outside of New York and Ellis Island. We had folks coming from everywhere. I mean, Baltimore was one of those places by virtue of where it sits, what some of its natural gifts were. You end up having this perfect, if you call it, melting pot of economic opportunity. So you draw in folks from Europe, you draw in folks from all over this country, the South and the North kind of simultaneously. Baltimore becomes the center place where the United States is replacing its agrarian economy with an industry economy. And that's why Baltimore is very important to U.S. history. Now, with all of this immigration, what you get is kind of like this kind of feudalistic tribalism in the sense that you have ethnic immigrants coming in, you have industrialists from the South who are trading in their farms for an opportunity to industrialize or to make money off of industry. And you have a great banking system here, but it's very, we're just going to say it's very segregated at that point in time. Not all opportunities are extended to all cultures of people through banking. Like I said, it's an urban port, and it has lots of great attributes by virtue of the fact that in 1776, Baltimore already had 8 steel plants centered around Baltimore, and had been in the business of doing business with the United States government since the history of the country. Now, this is really important because what you see here is you see a migration pattern to Baltimore that is unlike most other cities. And so from 1790 to about 1960, you see steady population growth in Baltimore, which I find like, it tells an invaluable tale. Folks are coming to Baltimore because there's lots and lots of opportunity here and there's lots of money to be made. Now, at the center of this opportunity is a late 19th century, early 20th century scientific notion called eugenics. Eugenics is important in the context of Baltimore discussions because this is the methodology by which Baltimore will divide its economies. So instead of having these fluid economies that run through these ethnic neighborhoods, essentially what Baltimore does is it divides itself into these ethnic neighborhoods, and based on your human desirability, you are afforded rights, you are afforded jobs, you are afforded education. More importantly, you are afforded health care. And so when you think in terms of eugenic models, there are disaffected communities, poor European communities, and African American communities that bear the brunt of these policy outcomes. One of the most noted cases that involved like this eugenics theory was a case in 1910 where Baltimore wrote an ordinance that divided the city up by race. And essentially, if you read the first bullet, that no Negro should take up residence a block within the city limits of Baltimore, wherein more than half of the residents are white. These notions not only exist in housing, but you see the evidence of this in education. I mean, Bob mentioned that I graduated from Dunbar. Well, everybody in East Baltimore that was African American who was born after 1937 graduated from Dunbar, because if you went to school in Baltimore, that was the place where you were afforded to go. If you lived on the west side, then you were afforded an opportunity to go to Douglas. If you lived in Baltimore County did not pay for education beyond the 8th grade for its African Americans. Those students had to take a test. Unlike white kids, and if they passed the test, then the county would pay for them to go to high school, but their parents had to make a way, and that school was Douglas. So kids would have to travel down from Towson and the surrounding areas to get an education. So there's housing, there's education, and like I said, there are eugenics and banking. There are there are very few banking opportunities. And when you think in terms of the industry culture that's emerging in the 1900s and what will come of it as of World War II, and how much money and how many economies will fall out of that, African Americans are only afforded the privilege of creating for themselves in communities, and very few opportunities to sell beyond the broader scope. Now, when we think in terms of using race as a predictor of variability, here are essentially how the resources are divided: English, Germans, Scots, and Irish, and Scandinavians. No, so one of the things that's really interesting about this list is Negroes are number 9, right? Blacks are on the original boats to Baltimore in 1634. The Ark and the Dove both contain citizens who are free and not of slave origins. And so essentially, all of the other populations begin to fill in after African Americans, but through this eugenics modeling, every time a new population of people comes to Baltimore, black people kind of lose a spot, if that makes any sense at all. Now, I wanted to talk about healthcare in East Baltimore, and I'm just going to kind of flash you a picture. These are all hospitals that were in East Baltimore at one point in time. So East Baltimore really didn't extend beyond Edison Highway. You had like this southeast, across the waterfront, which is now considered Canton. But you had all of these hospitals in East Baltimore at one point in time. You have Johns Hopkins at the center here. There's Sinai Hospital. There's St. Joseph's. Who did I leave off?
GBMC.
GBMC, no, I don't have GBMC, but I have Church Home Hospital. So Church, City, Sinai, Mercy, and St. Joe's. St. Joe's was up on Oliver Street.
And GBMC was on Baltimore Street.
So we had lots of hospitals in this Baltimore. Now, with all of that said, I want to, I'm going to leave it to the rest of the panelists to talk about what transpires after that. But today, the effects, from my vantage point, of building these two-tier systems in Baltimore have led to mortality rates of blacks to exceed whites in all 22 counties around Maryland. So you see this goes far beyond Baltimore's borders. Leading causes of death is heart disease, cancer, stroke, and I want to include other manageable diseases like asthma and diabetes. 9 out of 15 causes show disparities. The big killers today are obesity. And the irony is I read a recent study that basically says, noted that physicians are now have admitted biases towards obese patients. Heart disease mortality exceeds whites by 47.5 deaths per 100,000 per year. Blacks are twice as likely not to have health insurance coverage in this region. The infant mortality rates for blacks is twice that of whites. I think that's the price of the tiering that we built in and around Baltimore before and at the turn of the century. Thank you.
Thanks very much for setting the stage. You could talk from there as well.
Oh, thank
Yeah,
you.
go for it. Adrian Mosley.
I feel like the rose among the thorns. Somebody saw me yesterday, one of the members of the faculty saw me yesterday and gave me this bracelet, Be Nice. So I'm going to be nice. Those of you who know me know that I always claimed to have been a sane woman when I came here, but that was 35 years ago and a long time ago, and I lost my mind a long time ago. I want to talk a little bit about, being a social worker by training. I always approach things from a human standpoint, and I want to talk a little bit about what it was like. I was actually born at Hopkins. Didn't have much ambition. I'm still here. And so what I'd like to talk about is what it's like to be a person who works here and what it's like to try to be a community member in both communities, because that's what I do for a living. I spend my life working to build partnerships between Johns Hopkins and the community of which Hopkins is a part. And I see some community members who are in here and they're nodding because they know I talk about community with the big C. I believe that Hopkins is a part of this community and needs to act that way, as opposed to Hopkins and the community. When I came here, I actually came here to stay 5 years to get Hopkins on my resume and move on. As you can see, I have no ambition. I'm still here. And I think one of the reasons that I'm still here is that it's become my life's work, actually, to try and achieve that community with the big C. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I actually grew up right off of the 800 block of Broadway. When I was a little girl, that was Fraternity Row for the hospital, for the Hopkins community. And it was the biggest source of amusement to me because my brothers and I would go stand at the back door and watch the frat parties and watch people try to dance. It was better than television. And I think, though, what was very, very clear is in this community, Hopkins was seen in a love-hate relationship, and that exists still today. When I became the assistant director for social work for MedSurg, the late Lee Riley, who was chief of orthopedics, met me as I was meeting the 13 chiefs that I had to relate to, and he started to talk to me about the compound, that was the Hopkins residency housing that was built right behind where the Cooley Center sits. And he talked about that place being a very small place where his son was born. And he and his wife had a really tiny apartment, but it was very nice because they think about it with their greatest memories. And I felt myself choking up. And I said to him, I really wish I could walk down memory lane with you, but I can't. Because what I remember about that compound is they put a big iron fence around it. And I had to walk around it to get to elementary school. And so I think that graphically describes how the community views Hopkins and how Hopkins views itself. Now, I said it's a love-hate relationship. As I speak to you, my brother's mother-in-law is sitting in the second row, and I can tell her that if it were not for Hopkins having medical education in this community, my brother would never have met her daughter. He was climbing over a fence delivering his papers, and he struck a spike in his femoral artery and passed out on the street, and along came a medical student who stopped the bleeding. And so my brother is alive. He's sits on the second highest court in the country, the Fourth Circuit of Appeals Court, because a Hopkins student was in the neighborhood. And so when that happened, I said, I want to work at that place. I was 8 years old. And so began a journey for me of trying to be in both places, because this is still my community. And I'm still trying to make it one community. Now, what does that feel like? And I think that's key. In my work, I'm always saying to people don't trust Hopkins, but they certainly trust people from Hopkins. And so what I hope to do as I work is to always address those issues that are very important to community, but to address them in a way that I'm always saying, we have to do this together. Now, what does that do? I dye my hair because it is Snow White. And every process that I'm involved in is painstaking at best. I stand up and I say something that I think is very profound in a community meeting, and people say, sit down, you lost your mind, you've been up here too long, you crazy, just like them. And then I remind myself that a prophet is not without honor except in their own country, and I try to continue this reconciliation. I think in terms of what I see is that as a social worker by training, I come to work every day expecting to be fired. I've been disappointed for 35 years, and that's a good thing. Why do I think that? Because I believe that as a social worker, I am supposed to be an advocate. And so many, many times I'm speaking the truth that nobody wants to hear. The be nice that this person I put on my wrist is because sometimes the truth is not nice. And so we have to talk about, and very candidly, what our relationship has been. People won't forget. I don't try to tell people they didn't give people syphilis for that Tuskegee experiment, if that's what people believe. But we have to move from there to where we need to be in order to work in tandem. And what does that look like? I believe that looks like establishing a real sense of what the task is before us. And I think Ralph is going to really speak to that very clearly, some of the tasks that's before us. And it's more about achieving equity. Equitable partnerships are a real hard thing for Hopkins to do. People don't give up control here. We do silo play. We don't know the word transparency. And so those are the things that are before us to do every day. And I see somebody shaking their head because they know they hear this from me all the time. We have some beginnings, some good beginnings. I think the Urban Health Institute has played a major role in that. But we still have a long way to go toward building the trust and the transparency that we need to achieve.
Bishop Miles?
Bishop Douglas Miles, class of 1970, Johns Hopkins University. I want to talk a little bit about not the Hopkins, the Baltimore that I know, from both the standpoint of a clergy person and from the standpoint of a person who has roots on both sides of this city, having spent parts of my life in both East Baltimore and West Baltimore, and having deep roots on both sides of town. Baltimore, in my lifetime, has always been a city in conflict with itself. It's a southern town that wants to believe that it's a northern city. And that creates its own set of dynamics that operate in this city. It's a city where race colors every major decision that's made, from policies to programs. And it's a city that if it does not address the issue of race, will lag as a second or third tier city in this nation. That above everything else is what's strangling the life out of Baltimore. Its inability to have an open discussion about the role that race plays in this city. In the context of that is this mammoth institution called Johns Hopkins, and it represents, in my mind, what Baltimore is. Both it's the best that Baltimore is and the worst that Baltimore is. In the terms of the best that Baltimore is, Hopkins is a demonstration of what can happen when the power players in this city and in the surrounding counties come together around a common agenda with common goals and are willing to invest the monies necessary to make happen what they want to happen, as exemplified by the massive expansion of Hopkins over the years, the EBDI project, and everything that Hopkins has chosen to put its hands on. And what's been my experience is if you want to know the essence of an institution, you have to look not at its employees, but its board. And the board of Hopkins represents the power players of Baltimore. In the worst sense, it represents what happens when the major power players of this city then choose not to address the legitimate needs of the overall community of Baltimore. And that's what has happened historically in Baltimore. That's what has happened historically in the role that Hopkins has played in the life of Baltimore. That's why you have so many neighborhoods that are just completely decimated, totally ignored, when in reality there's a great deal of wealth in the city of Baltimore. Baltimore right now is a powder keg, and anyone that does not recognize that is living in a bubble. The corporate community has come to an awareness that Baltimore is a powder keg that's ready to explode. And unless the legitimate needs of the surrounding, of the neighborhoods are met, unless there's an investment in our young people, an investment in ex-offenders, an investment in seeking to eradicate the many problems that confront many of the neighborhoods of Baltimore, Baltimore is destined to explode, and the explosion will be ugly. A few weeks ago, I shared in a focus group around health disparities in the city, and as I sat there, I got angry as I looked at, and as we talked about the African-American community, particularly in Baltimore, the litany of problems that are present in the African-American community in Baltimore are not present anywhere else in America. The litany of problems. HIV/AIDS at staggering rates, hypertension, heart disease, cancer, tobacco-related illnesses, diabetes, obesity, asthma, hantavirus, violence, poverty, crime, incarceration, high dropout rate, failing schools, poor housing, lack of affordable quality housing and health care, food deserts, high unemployment among teens, drug abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, single-parent households, low life expectancy, lack of recreation, lack of city services, and the litany goes on, and this would not be tolerated in any other community in America. And if Baltimore doesn't address it, if Hopkins does not, as Ralph calls it the 500-pound gorilla, I call it the 900-pound gorilla. If the 900-pound gorilla of this city does not lead the effort to address these problems, it will both fail its calling and it will fail itself, this city, and this region.
Ralph?
Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everyone. I think, as I count them, Hopkins has four faces. There's the face that is known around the world for being a leader in, science and medicine with Nobel laureates, and its hospital being rated the best in the country and among the best in the world, easily. And that Hopkins is known. And then there's the faces that we in Baltimore, who have been here for some years, see all the time. And one of those faces is the face of evil. And it's exemplified by the rumors that have swirled in this town for many, many years. You may or may not have heard them. That if you walk by Hopkins Hospital on a Friday or Saturday night, parents would warn and grandparents would warn their children. You could be snatched and dragged in and used for experimentation, and you may or may not come back out. If you had an earache and you went to the emergency room, you might come out with your ear removed or cut off. These rumors existed, and they persisted for many, many years in the East Baltimore areas. So it's Hopkins as body snatcher. Remember those movies, The Invasion of the Body Snatcher? That was a very real image that some people carried. And there are grandparents in our town and parents, middle-aged folks like ourselves, who know of those stories. And somehow these stories have been passed down for many, many years. So understand that that's part of the face of Hopkins that exists out there. And I remember my good friend, Dr. Chester Wickwire, who was chaplain at Johns Hopkins for about 40-some years, and who died about 5 or 6 years ago, telling me that in 1968, in the riots in Baltimore following the assassination of Martin Luther King, he and some others from the Homewood campus came down and stood near the Hopkins medical institutions to try to convince people and block people from going in and trying to tear down some of the buildings in this neighborhood brick by brick. There was that level of anger towards Johns Hopkins. You should know that. You should be aware of that. And at the very least, that sense of Hopkins as evil was buttressed by the fact that Hopkins maintained segregated emergency rooms and wards for colored people, separate. In fact, Henrietta Lacks, that you may or may not have heard of, was in a colored ward when her cancerous cells were removed from her uterus some years ago. That's the first face. Then there's the face of Hopkins as arrogant. And it seems to me the arrogance is exemplified by, or is made example by the treatment of Vivian Thomas, Dr. Vivian Thomas, whose picture, I guess, is out here somewhere, right? Isn't his portrait out in the main lobby somewhere?
It's on the first floor.
Of the hospital?
Yes.
Of the Blaylock building?
Yes.
It's ironic because he worked with Alfred Blaylock, and Blaylock gets buildings named after him, doesn't he? And I think they finally managed to put a picture of Vivian Thomas. There's a great movie representation of the Vivian Thomas story called Something the Lord Has Made. Have you seen it? It stars Mos Def,
Yeah.
who's got a different name now. I can't remember what it is, but he's changed his name again. But anyway, I highly recommend it. It's an HBO movie, and I think it very well portrays that story of how this laboratory assistant essentially stood over Blaylock's shoulder and gave him instruction on how to do open heart surgery, essentially, and created some instruments to help conduct open heart surgery. And he was kind of lost in history, but he provided a lot of information, a lot of research, a lot of assistance, and opened up some doors in that whole field. And it took many, many years for him to be recognized. Henrietta Lacks, whom I spoke of earlier, a woman who came into Hopkins Hospital in 1950 or so, and had cancerous cells removed from her uterus, and they happened to survive and grow and ended up being reproduced, shipped, sold, researched upon all over the world. And without her knowledge, her cells were removed. Without her family's authorization or knowledge, and without any compensation to her or to her family. That seems like arrogance to me too. And finally, I always like to talk about my friend Mamie Brown, who worked over at the Homewood campus of Johns Hopkins. And as Doug was leaving Hopkins, I was there from 1970 to 1974. I was in the class.
That's
of
his
70.
sly way of calling me old.
No, you're not that old.
Not that old.
But Mamie Brown worked in Levering Hall in the cafeteria. And I would go in there every single day just about and get a bowl of chili. And every day she'd stand there and ladle a bowl of chili for a friend of mine and myself. Well, many years later, in 2000, I went up to the campus to work with some Hopkins students who had formed the Student Labor Action Coalition. And they were trying to work to get better wages for Hopkins employees. Now, Doug here was with the BUILD organization when they created the first living wage law in the country. That was in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. First in the country, a living wage law. Well, there still needed to be a way to get institutions in town to implement that law or to emulate that law in some ways. And so Hopkins students took over the administration building to get that done. But I went up there for a meeting one day, because I started working with them, and ducked into Levering Hall because I got there too early. And there was Miss Mamie Brown, many years later, standing in the same spot, ladling soup and making sandwiches. And so I asked her, "How long have you worked here, Miss Brown?" After we greeted each other. And she said, "I've been here for 55 years. Now, she was technically working for Sodexo Marriott at the time, which was a private company that was doing the food service. But in her mind, she still worked at Johns Hopkins and was in the same place. And I didn't have the heart to ask her, but I asked one of the union leaders up there what did they think she earned. And they said they thought she earned about $8 or $9 an hour. And this is after 55 years. So that's the arrogant Johns Hopkins. And when you look at how the Hopkins, the institution, has been organized, the creation of the Dome Corporation some 27 years ago, where service workers essentially are maintained. That's your food service, your security, and your housekeeping folks. Those folks are considered separate and apart from your other regular Hopkins employees. And we know that they don't get the benefits that the regular Hopkins employees get. For example, there's a Live Near Your Work program where Hopkins will help you be able to purchase a home. They'll give you a subsidy to purchase a home if you're going to buy in the Hopkins areas, whether it's in the Homewood area and generally around that campus or around this campus somewhere. We know that they are not eligible for the tuition. I don't believe they're eligible for the tuition reimbursement program that Hopkins provides its employees. The question is why. These are Hopkins employees, save some technicality. And that's arrogant, I think. That's the arrogant face of Hopkins, that they dare do that to citizens of Baltimore. And then thirdly, there's the face of Hopkins that I think is trying to be a better citizen. And I think the Office of Urban Health is an example of it trying to be better. The chaplain's office for many years, where the second oldest tutoring program in the city was operated for many years. The Office of Social Concern, some of the things that are going on in the East Baltimore community development area. And they're represented by great people such as Bob is a good one, Amy's a good one, Deirdre Bishop, Joe Smith, Phil Leaf over there. But these are people who are out into the community and are goodwill ambassadors for Hopkins, and they've always been there at different folks at Hopkins. I think a good face of Hopkins is, and Adrian, of course, a good face of Hopkins is represented by its Baltimore Scholars Program, which was created to guarantee that if a student graduates from a Baltimore City public school and gets admitted to Hopkins, they can go and have their tuition paid for by Johns Hopkins. I think that's a step in the right direction, but Hopkins still has some things to do. I think it could begin by erasing that second-class institutionalized citizenship that exists by virtue of its operation of the Dome Corporation. I think its real estate company, Johns Hopkins Real Estate, is planning or is in the middle of doing $1 billion worth of construction and renovation, and that with our unemployment issue in Baltimore, that maybe we can mix those two issues together. Maybe Hopkins Real Estate can make a better effort at training and employing Baltimore citizens, which is very sorely needed. I think it's hopeful that Hopkins, for example, has a Jewish president. There was a time when Hopkins had quotas as to how many Jewish students they take. I think it got up to 17%. If you'll read "Not in My Neighborhood" by Antero Piatella, it details that. And I have the citing here. I have the book here, and I have the citing if you ever want to see that. So that's a sign of hope, I think, that things are trying to turn around, trying to change. But that also is evidence that there is a long way for us to go, I think. And Hopkins needs to be a leader. I think the reason why we took on Hopkins in terms of its employment practices and work with those students, and I stayed in Garland Hall overnight, 3 nights. It was the 3 longest nights of my life, was because we expect Hopkins to be a leader. It's known as a leader around the world, and it has to be a leader here at home. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you all. There are so many points that were raised and so many pieces. Let me just pick up on, a couple. I suspect if I were to ask people sitting on the other side of your table, what is Johns Hopkins, to a person, they would answer, it's a university. If you go out to the neighborhood and ask 100 people what is Johns Hopkins, almost no one will say it's a university. It is not a university. It is a hospital. When people in this community, if they know of anyone whose first name is Ron, it is not Ron Daniels, who's the president of the university. It's Ron Peterson, who's the CEO of the hospital. This is a medical institution, and that is the context of how it is viewed. In the School of Public Health and the School of Nursing are subsumed under JHMI, Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions, and that is the community's lens. You all raised an incredible number of issues. I'd like to pick up on one. Race colors everything. Race colors everything, and Baltimore does not discuss race. We don't have a history of discussing it, whether we are black or white. Our politicians shy away from discussing issues of race, the role of race within the university, the history that this was a segregationist institution is one that we acknowledge but don't ever discuss. How do we get beyond that?
We just do it. There was a period in Baltimore in the mid to late 60s where race was beginning to be discussed. And as the civil rights movement waned, that kind of discussion broke down. And I think what's bothering Baltimore more than anything else is the lack of relationships. You can't discuss difficult issues where there are no relationships. Right. And presently in Baltimore, we're at a low point in terms of being a relational community. There used to be dialogue, among all segments of the community, backdoor dialogues, open dialogues, and those just don't exist because the relationships no longer are there. Baltimore has very few homegrown corporate leaders now, so that plays into it. And unfortunately, with the constant rotation of religious leadership, it makes it difficult to maintain relationships over a sustained period of time. And the simple breakdown of neighborhoods, 200 named. I don't think that there are really 200 communities in Baltimore, and certainly not 35 healthy neighborhoods. And that's what's crippling us in terms of our ability to discuss the most dominant issue in this city, and that's race.
So when I think in terms of this issue, I always think in terms of the history. The reason that Baltimoreans didn't discuss race was because it put at risk federal finances. I mean, you had Quakers coming into the state who were venture capitalists alongside Southern industrialists, who were had their designs on capital gains from or gaining capital momentum from Washington D.C. And in a lot of instances, it just did not look well to have this discussion. So what you see evolve across a period of time is this fascination with not talking about race in polite conversation. And so when you evolve from that spacing, the thing that I say most notably is, one, those economies are no longer at stake, right? And so the need just has to be there from a different vantage point. I like to think that the 800-pound gorilla gets the conversation started by virtue of the fact that I think one of the things that I hear from the panel consistently is, if it's not started, then the entity who has the most to lose is the 800-pound gorilla. I mean, the community has been losing for a century now, and so they're kind of used to it. I mean, in a sense, but I think economically, the hit will be hardest felt at Johns Hopkins if we don't evolve the discussion.
I think part of what I'm seeing is that there is no collective memory of what racism is. When I talk about racism to students, they say nobody's racist here. Right. And what? And so I think when people translate it to be personal racism as opposed to institutional, and so policy making, decision making, the deal is made before we come into the room. What's going to happen has been made by 2 or 3 people behind the doors. And so until we maybe not have a discussion necessarily about race, but about equity and about shared decision making, those things translate into a change, I think, without, if I can't get you can't remember the 60s if you weren't there. I do. And so because I'm not looking for personal racism, I'm actually looking for institutional racism. Right. And when I say it's racist, I'm seeing institutional racism. I'm seeing how policies are formed so that people don't participate fully. And so having those discussions about equity, maybe not so much about race, because I don't know how to make people know what they haven't experienced. But I can say, we're going to come into the room and we're going to look at what are the things we're trying to achieve, what are those core values that we agree to live by, and what's outside of that. Having those discussions, I think, will move us toward it. And I do agree that it's the responsibility of the 900-pound gorilla to get those things started.
He keeps getting fatter.
He gets bigger. He gets fatter because I think he plays like Pac-Man, and he's eating up the resources that have to go toward this effort. And so in my work, like I said, the community sees Hopkins as one thing. It's the hospital. And so there aren't these clearly defined silos. And so I sit on a committee, for instance, that's looking at community benefit dollars and how the discretionary money, if there's any, gets divided to a community good. But that's a hospital discussion. Why is that not a system discussion? Right. And why are we not looking at the resources across the system And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
I think race does get discussed in town more than we might realize. I think of a couple of things. One is the Open Society Institute has been holding forums about race, and I think they're fairly well attended. Now, that's not a citywide dialogue, but it's more than what we used to have, and so I think we ought to give that credit. I've talked about race before the Greater Baltimore Committee leadership for the last 22 years. That's the business leaders in town, and they asked me to come and talk about the other Baltimore. And I said, well, first of all, the other Baltimore is you, not the poor folks. But second of all, that you can't talk about poverty without talking about race, the concentrations of poverty that exist in the African American community in Baltimore and around the country. It's interesting. I have this article, I just saw this the other day. I was at Morgan University, and I picked up this magazine, and there's an article about the Morgan University students' involvement in the sit-in movement, which began with Morgan State University.
Absolutely.
And that's not very well known. And that's because there's an attempt to repress this kind of stuff, I think. And I think this book, Not in My Neighborhood, has spurred some conversations that didn't exist before. Now, again, this isn't everything, but this is a start, I think. And it's got to lead to some understanding that there has to be a plan to change. You can't just talk about it and hope that things get better, that from any discussion, there's a concrete plan on how things will change. I know highly qualified professional people who say it's very hard to get hired by Johns Hopkins, that they were vetted many times over, and if they finally got the job, it was after going through quite a ringer. And they witnessed other people who got a job just by dropping their name. I think that's true. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think that kind of thing still exists. And I think a person who has a quality degree from Morgan State University versus a student from Johns Hopkins or Loyola is of equal accomplishment, essentially, is considered, the Morgan student is considered the lesser bet in terms of hiring. And we got to get through that. We got to cut through that crap, I would say. Anyway.
So let's please join the conversation. If you just raise your hand, there's Dina on that side has a mic. You're on. Introduce yourself first, and then we'll pass it to you.
Hi, my name is Loretta, and I've lived in several different university towns, and this seems, just from what I'm hearing, a more extreme case of what happens in many university towns, in the big division between all of the highfalutin whatever that's happening in the glass tower of the university versus the community, and that community divide. And I really like what you said, Adrian, right, about if the discussion is around equity and shared decision making, that involves everybody, so that and can help maybe bridge the gap between a university and the community, which is just so common anyway, and this even more so.
I have one comment. I think it also needs to be about validation. One of the things that we talk about very tenuously is these notions of being snatched off the street at Johns Hopkins or in Baltimore, as though the notion is just silly. And if you know the history of research medicine in America, you'd understand that 90% of the African Americans who lived in America lived below the Mason-Dixon line, and the majority of experimentation, almost all women-related experimentation happened on Black and Spanish women. You know, in Black prisons, in Black hospitals, you know, in places where Black people congregated. So to kind of dispel these notions as though they don't exist does not improve the relationship that one would have to have in a research-based organization in order to kind of, you know, get the best work accomplished. So, I mean, I think like when we think in terms of next steps, it's also about not only the next steps, but how we do things across the board, how we communicate outwardly what the vision is, whether or not we are transparent in our notions and our desire to do well for the entire community, not just for the Hopkins-based community.
I think the point that you make leads me to say one thing that all of us should do, is that when we hear a myth, to ask the question, how did it come to be?
That's
Not,
right.
this sounds crazy.
Right.
Because it may sound crazy,
Absolutely.
but in every myth,
Absolutely.
there is something
Some
that
level of
triggered it.
reality.
There is some history
Somebody's reality.
that perhaps got embellished, but has led to that notion, and the power of the myth is a reality. So just a brief introduction to the next person who will make a comment. Ernest Smith is an extraordinary community partner and someone who has worked elbow to elbow with many at Hopkins on a wide range of issues.
All right. And a few of the panelists I know I've at least had the pleasure. Matter of fact, all the panelists have actually had the pleasure of meeting at one point in time or another. But there was a statement and a term that was made, and that term was relationships. Because right now, as for most of us, as we're working and we're doing this, we're seeking to develop these relationships. And I appreciate the Urban Health Institute and the work that they're doing, through which many of the relationships I have been able to generate over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been quite helpful. However, there is the issues of the finance, because I have backgrounds, unbelievable backgrounds, but breaking through some of the doors has been a tough issue as a result. And I recognize what some of them are. But my question is, how do we move into a point where we are able to utilize, as you would say, the gorilla in the room? I'm not sure how big he is, because he might have just passed 900 the moment we had this conversation.
He's
But
1,000 pounds.
1,000 pounds.
But we need to, but how do you see us being able to begin moving those conversations? Because as you pointed out, Ralph, that you go to this meeting where people are talking about the other Baltimore, who aren't recognizing that they are the other Baltimore. How can we begin to get those people in the room? Because it's there that the difference, we can now have that race conversation, the equity conversation, and literally begin to deal with both the disparity and leadership issues that are now plaguing Baltimore, and as you pointed out at the beginning, could become the spark that lights that powder keg.
Let me, because unfortunately I have to run, but I think that your current president has shot the first salvo over the bow and is not well liked in corporate Baltimore. Ron Daniels issued a challenge to the corporate community of Baltimore to make its dollars count in terms of lifting Baltimore and making the commitment and saying to the corporate community that it has a moral obligation to make Baltimore better, and that he was going to try to make sure that Hopkins dollars invested in Baltimore went toward that purpose of trying to make Baltimore a better place for all of its citizens and not just for downtown. I don't think that was well received. But I think that that's the kind of thing that Hopkins has to do consistently. Hopkins is the one institution that has the power to convene the developers, the other corporate leaders in the city, the politicians, community leaders, and say, these are the problems. You know, this is the best research, one of the best research institutions in the world. The problems of Baltimore have been clearly defined. And what has to happen now is we have to be willing as a community to come together and say, we're going to develop a plan to begin to address these issues. Relationships don't come about because it's a nice thing to do. They come about because of self-interest. And the corporate community in this city has to begin to see that it's in their long-term self-interest to start correcting the problems in this city, as exemplified by what's going on in the Inner Harbor right now, where you can get an outside politician screaming about black gangs, and the city, rather than standing up and saying, no, this isn't the case, reacts to that craziness and starts putting even more police in downtown, where my group, Build, went down there to in the East Harbor, and we were welcomed to Baltimore. Hell, I've been here my whole life, but I'm being welcomed to my city? But that's the kind of thing that has to be broken down, and Hopkins has to take the lead. Again, I'm sorry I have to run. My wife's birthday.
Let me just interject. First of all, thank you very much for joining, and happy birthday to your wife. I would just ground this conversation. We have about 3 more minutes, and you will get the final comment or question. To say this isn't just at an institutional level. I would suggest at an individual level, relationships are built by showing up. Go to a local church. Go to 2 local churches. East Baltimore has hundreds of churches. You don't have to walk but 2 blocks to find 3 churches. Go to one. And then show up again. Volunteer. Source is a network for volunteer services. Offer to help somebody somewhere in this community, and then go back the next day, the next week. That's how you build relationships. Because Hopkins, people may have concerns about the institution, but at an individual level, it is or are those relationships. Stephen, a quick comment, and then you get the last question, because there is a 1:30 class that comes in here.
I'm sorry, a real quick comment about what will move the ball. So about 3 or 4 years ago, 2 PhDs from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg, Dr. Daryl Gaskins and Dr. Thomas Levis, did an economic study. And basically, in our business, the business of delivering medicine, they showed indications that over a 3-year period, over $283 billion was lost in healthcare disparities, indirect costs. $1.27 trillion in indirect costs. So I'm all for the moral obligation, but those are big dollar figures. And I think once you start to kind of look at it through the business model, then you are incentivized in a much greater way.
Last comment or question?
Hi. So I manage a project here at the school that works with faith communities on food security issues and other food system things. And one of the words that keeps coming up for me is power, which we talked race. Yeah?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. But power. And when we're doing this work, at least in my project, we're always sort of thinking about these power differentials that exist, whereas we're up here at Hopkins and hey, we're very cognizant of not going somewhere and saying this is what we think you need and asking that question, but the mere sort of extending of, hey, would you like to get together and talk about this sort of feels like a little bit of that anyway. And so my question is for Hopkins, are there any channels by which the community can approach Hopkins and say, hey, this is what we'd like from you, this is what we need, in order to sort of even out that power thing that is clearly present here?
I don't think that that's so much about power as it is about relationship. There's a quote that I use that I don't know who said it, but it says, if you are here to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if you are here because you think your destiny is tied up with mine, then let the work begin. And so I think it's mostly attitudinal. You can always reach out to community. I've never seen the community reject anybody that honestly reached out from their heart. If you go out there and say, I'm here to learn, I'm here to hear what you need to say, I'm here because I have my shovel ready, show me where to dig, it's different. And so, I think power, I'm actually trying to teach in my walk in life that the community has power. We have a big opportunity for changing how we do healthcare. who said that somebody should take a magic marker and write the plan? You say, not on my watch. I don't own that. That doesn't reflect me. And when it starts to affect how the dollars flow, you got power. It's thinking, again, a different way, and helping communities to be part of the solution, not giving them a solution.
Ralph,
I
you
think
have
the most
30 seconds, and Stephen, you do
The
as
most
well.
important skill you can have as you travel out and visit churches and offer to volunteer is your ability to listen and hear what people are saying to you. You know, they don't have to be PhDs, they don't have to be world-renowned, they don't have to be experts. They're human beings who know life and who've lived through and endured quite a bit. So I would suggest that if you can listen. And speaking of healthcare, a cheap plug, I have some re-elect Obama bumper stickers if you care for them. I think the healthcare plan, the affordable healthcare plan, will help people. And I remember 4 years ago how much up in arms people were over health care, and how that kind of disappeared over the summer of 2009 with the screaming and hollering at town hall meetings. It's still needed. It's still very, very much needed. It hasn't been implemented fully yet. Most of it hasn't, in fact, not until 2014. Anyway, I have these bumper stickers. If you want them, you can have them. You'd be well to take them, I think, because the other guy ain't going to make you any healthier. But that's just
Stephen, next.
As one of the local historians, I have gathered a lot of reading materials, and a lot of the stuff has been developed right here at Johns Hopkins. I left my reading list out on that stool in the corner. Make sure that you grab a copy of it. There are some wonderful books, and like I said, a lot of this scholarship is just really starting to come to bear. You know, so a lot, you know, it's relative. A lot of these texts have only been written like the last 2 or 3, maybe 5 years. So get to know our town. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful town.
And I would extend the same invitation that we made last week, and that is that the Baltimore Book Club will, this next academic year, reconvene. We will use some of these books to look at the issues of race in Baltimore, because it is a central issue. And I would thank the entire panel for their insights and thoughts.